Good morning, class. Last week, we treated chapter 3 with the title Centers of Ancient Civilization. In that chapter 3, we identified centers where ancient civilizations occurred in Nigeria, such as North in Kaduna State, Ife in Ochun State, Igbuku in Anambra State, Ibini in Edo State. Today, we are going to look at the traditions of origin of the Nigerian people. This chapter 4, we are going to break it into two, part 1 and part 2. These traditions of origin, in part 1, we are going to look at the definition of traditions of origin, types, categories, values of traditions of origin, and the significance. In part 2, we now look at the specific traditions of origin of various people of Nigeria, such as the Hausa, the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Bini, the Efik, the Igbira, and the rest of them. But now, let us look at the introduction. We say that Nigeria is a multi-ethnic country. Each ethnic group and subgroup has its tradition of origin, which tends to emphasize ethnic individualism. But a more careful examination of the traditions will reveal the existence of links amongst the ethnic groups, thus showing group identities and intergroup relationship. Even though the traditions of origin are mostly oral accounts of the beginnings of different societies in Nigeria, its main importance lies in the fact that it helps the people to reconstruct and redocument the history of their preliterate era. It covers serious ideas about their migrations, the wars they fought, the environmental challenges they encountered, their arts, symbols, and their belief system. Therefore, apart from the excitement and controversies generated from the studies in Nigerian people's traditions of origin, the study is one of the best ways and channels that help us have sound knowledge and understanding of Nigeria and its peoples, especially in pre-colonial times. The objectives. At the end of this chapter 4, our students should be able to 1. Define the traditions of origin, examine the nature and limitations or problems of oral tradition, relate the different groups of people occupying the various zones to their traditions of origin, account for their economic, social, and political organizations, know the similarities and dissimilarities among them. We now look at oral tradition and its meaning. And we say that oral tradition is a belief or behavior passed down within a group or society with symbolic meaning or special significance with origins of the past. Traditions can persist and evolve for thousands of years. Therefore, traditions of origin of Nigerian people are oral accounts about the beginnings of various ethnic groups, usually given by each of them from generation to generation and from time immemorial. We now look at different types of oral traditions of origin, and we identified two types of traditions of origin: eyewitness accounts and non-witness accounts. When we are talking about the eyewitness account, we say that an eyewitness account, the informant or narrators talk about events which they experience directly, either as actors or interested observers. While in the non-eyewitness account, the narrators or informants talk about events which did not happen in their lifetime, but which they heard about from their elders. Having looked at the different types of eyewitness accounts, we are now going to look at the values of oral traditions of origin. Oral traditions of origin help us fill an important gap in the reconstruction of the early history of Nigeria. Point number two, many existing written sources by European visitors hardly focus on that part of Nigerian history. Thus, oral traditions play a great role in filling the gap. Three, oral traditions enable us to see more clearly our history from the African or Nigerian viewpoint due to their emphasis on the ideas behind the actions of men. Thus, they are effective sources of removing some or all of the distortions in some European accounts of the Nigerian past. Having seen the importance or the values of oral tradition of origin, we are now going to look at the limitations of oral traditions of origin. Yes, we believe that tradition of origin is important in the reconstruction of Nigerian history. But that does not becloud or close our eyes in looking at the limitations that are posed by the traditions of origin of Nigerian people. Number one limitation is that oral traditions are easily subjected to alterations by the informant or narrators who are influenced either by the political, economic, and social circumstances or the minds of their time. Point number two, oral traditions do not give precise chronology. That is, their time perspective is imperfect. As a result, it is almost impossible to see how changes took place over time by depending on oral tradition. We have to note below that these limitations do not, however, remove the values mentioned above. Instead, they show that oral traditions should be cautiously used in history. Like other sources of history, they are not to be taken on the face value. Here in this subtopic or sub-branch, we are going to look at the categories of traditions of oral categories of traditions of origin. We are going to, or we may identify five. The first one, or we say that the tradition of origin of Nigerian people are in varying degrees of forms on the basis of their central point of emphasis or of what could be called the core of each tradition. Falola and his fellow authors identified five categories of traditions of origin in Nigeria. Number one, tradition of origin through migration and marriage. A notable example is the tradition of origin of Hausa people. The tradition claims that the Hausa are the descendants of the offspring of the marriage between a migrant Bajida or Abu Aziz from Baghdad and Queen Daura and the Queen of Daura in Katsina State. Number two category is tradition of origin in terms of migration and relationship with other Nigerian groups, such as the Jukum, the people that have this tradition of migration and relationship are the people of Jukun, Nupe, Urobo, Igala, Idoma, Efik, Ibibio. Traditions in varying degrees belong to this group. Number three, tradition of origin from a common ancestor. The most typical of this category of tradition is that of the Yoruba, in which it is claimed that the Yoruba are the descendants of a man called Oduduwa. The fourth category of tradition of origin is through migration from the east. A notable example is that of Benin. According to this tradition, popularized by Jacob Egavaba, the Benis came from Egypt after a brief stop in the Sudan and Ile-Ife respectively. The point number 5 of tradition of origin is a tradition as independent or autonomous emergence. The Igbo and Ijaw traditions are very typical in this connection, except for a few variants. The traditions of Igbo and Ijaw origins indicate that the people do not trace their beginnings to other places. Similarly, they do not lay claim to common ancestry. Consequently, there are generally as many traditions of origin as there are subgroups or clans within the Igbo and the Ijaw. We now look at the significances of the traditions of origin. Yes, a lot of people, or we may consider traditions of origin as purely legend. But the fact remains that without these traditions of origin, our reconstruction of our history may not be complete. So we now look at the significance of traditions of origin. Number one, they confirm the fact that the cultures and civilization of Nigerian people are of considerable antiquity or age. They show quite clearly that from earliest times, Nigerians became the prime architect of their own development. Thus, even when the traditions speak of migration from elsewhere, they still show how the Nigerian groups developed on their own terms and style. And finally, it is obvious from the account that Nigerian people, even in the distant past, had considerable links among themselves. So, we will end our discussion in this tradition of origin of Nigerian people, part 1 today. Next week, we shall start with the tradition of origin of Nigerian people, part 2, where we will specifically x-ray or talk about the migrations of different states or communities in Nigeria. We shall look at the migration story or history of the Hausas, the Igbos, the Yorubas, and the rest. Thank you so much.